Hey everyone, tonight we start with some strange twists of fate that were so strange that even the medieval church had to stop and say, okay, that's weird. Before you settle in, please like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And please tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from all over the world. Now, turn down the lights. You could turn on a fan to make a soft noise in the background. And let's take it easy as we start our hazy little trip together tonight. At 11:45, England was still trying to figure out how shoes worked, and everyone had a name that sounded like a sneeze or William or Henry. Two noble families in the city of Winchester celebrated the birth of baby boys, both of whom were named William, because it seems like being original was a sin back then. These were not just any Williams, they looked exactly like each other. Born a few weeks apart, raised in the same town, the same swordmaster, and according to one monk, even the same holy water that was stolen a little bit. Their families were proud, but it's not clear if they were proud of their sons or just proud that they remembered which William was theirs at dinner. The Williams stayed very much the same as adults. The same shoulder-length haircut, which was the norm in the Middle Ages, and the same scar on the left cheek from the same jousting accident, because coordination wasn't genetic, and the name of the wife is Alice, because back then, even love stories weren't very creative. The monks who wrote about all this said it was a sign from God, which is what people in the Middle Ages called anything that made them uneasy, but didn't want to explain. On a sunny spring morning, both Williams went hunting in different woods at the same time. They each saw a deer, lowered their lances, charged forward, and then stabbed themselves with them. Same injury, same place, same day. It's hard to tell what's more impressive, the odds or the level of athleticism needed to lose to your own weapon. The news hit Winchester like a slapstick joke from God. Two priests named Thomas led two funerals in the same church. Two widows named Alice were there for both of them, and they both fainted at the same verse of the same hymn. Chroniclers weren't sure if they should call it sad or useful. The bishop said it was proof that God works in strange ways. Of course, it could be mysterious or just a little sarcastic. The people in the area started calling them the Twin Williams, but the idiot. It might have been more accurate for the brothers who came up with Darwinism. Historians still don't know how it happened. But I think God was bored, because if you were God in 1145 and saw peasants farming turnips all day, you'd probably want to do something different. In 1170, Canterbury Cathedral was a place where miracles, politics, and gossip all sat in the same pew. Chanting monks, flickering candles, and somewhere deep inside, fate was clearing its throat. As the choir sang their usual hymn, which was in the key of eternal suffering, one monk suddenly stopped in the middle of the verse. According to the records, his name was Brother Edmund. It could have been Edmune, Edmund, or just Guy who freaked out during prayer, even though the spelling is from the Middle Ages. Edmund whispered, "He is dead," and everyone stopped singing. In a medieval monastery, this was basically a crime against the state. The previous one looked at him like he had just asked the Virgin Mary a question. Making food. Who? Someone asked. And Edmund, who was apparently now the voice of the supernatural, said, Our Archbishop. A few minutes later, a messenger burst through the cathedral doors, out of breath and covered in horse sweat, shouting that King Henry's knights had just killed Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. The monks inside the same cathedral turned white. They were actually singing in the choir while their boss was being stabbed in the room next door. The sound quality in the Middle Ages was good, but not great. The prediction made by Brother Edmund became very popular right away. The monks called it a revelation from God. The church said it was proof of God's favor. Everyone else quietly wondered if Edmund had very thin walls and could hear very well. But the story still spread all over England. Many pilgrims went to Canterbury to see where the monk who heard death once stood. Artists painted him with a halo made of gold. People wrote ballads, and of course the church built a shrine because nothing says I'm sorry like selling tickets to it. Years later, another monk said he heard voices before a fire broke out in the church. The abbot had a rule by then: no more holy prophecies during Vespers. They hurt morale and insurance rates. Modern historians say it was just a coincidence, a very scary one that happened at just the right time. But I think Brother Edmund just had one of those sixth senses that all introverts have. The ability to tell when something really awkward is about to happen. Is about to happen. That was pretty much every day in medieval England. In 1350, Italy. Most artists were still warming up during the Renaissance, and they were painting saints who looked like they would rather be anywhere else. But there was one painter in the city of Modena who stood out. Tommaso Deodina was so talented and ahead of his time that he accidentally came up with prophetic art. Tommaso painted a mural of monks with strange bird-beaked masks a full century before the Black Death killed half of Europe No one questioned it at the time. People would just nod their heads in respect if an artist painted an angel fighting a fish. But when the plague came 100 years later, doctors started wearing the same masks. It has long noses, hollow eyes, and straps that make it look like a nightmare. A picture that Tommaso had already put up on a church wall. Historians today say it's just a coincidence. People in the Middle Ages thought it was magic. I think Tommaso just had one of those creepy gifts for knowing when things would go wrong. You know, the guy who paints a boat right before a flood and says, I don't know, I just felt like it. Back then, plague doctors thought that putting herbs and vinegar-soaked sponges in those masks would keep the disease from spreading. In reality, it just made them smell a little better as they died. But Tommaso's mural looked almost exactly the same, even with the herbs in the beak. People freaked out when they saw the similarities 100 years later. People from all over Italy came to see the painting. Sure, it was a warning from God. The church said it was a miracle. The priests in the area said it was very disturbing, especially since the mural was right next to the dining hall. For a time, people treated Tommaso's painting like a sacred object. It was prayed to by monks. Villagers brought gifts, and one abbot said that the masked monk's eyes moved a little every full moon. Spoiler alert, they didn't. The light from the candle just flickered. But people in the Middle Ages never let physics get in the way of a good haunting. Sadly, Tommaso died before he could paint any follow ups, most likely for the best. Europe didn't need a fresco of people coughing blood and a title like Work in Progress. Art historians are still arguing about it hundreds of years later. Was it a vision, a coincidence, or just a guy who happened to paint the creepiest trailer for the end of the world? No matter what the truth is, Tommaso Deodana is still the only artist whose work went viral 100 years after it came out. It was 1346, and Europe was once again having its favorite event, the Hundred Years' War. Somewhere, King John of Bohemia decided that being blind shouldn't stop him from fighting in the middle of the chaos. In the Middle Ages, there was no such thing as a bad idea, only hold my chalice. Years ago, John lost his sight because of an illness, but that didn't stop him from demanding that his troops go into battle at Sai. His knights tried to talk him out of it, probably saying things like, "Sire, you can't see the enemy." John is said to have replied, "Neither can they, once I'm done." It was a great speech. He did this until he tied his horse to his knight's reins and told them to charge. You can see it, 5 horses running into the fog of war, their tails tied together like the most dangerous friendship bracelet in the world. Chroniclers say they fought well. I think they just couldn't help themselves. When everything was said and done, the whole team was dead, still tied up, and they looked like they were in a medieval cautionary tale called Why Helmets Aren't Everything. That would have been enough of a lesson for most people. But no, history seems to have liked the bit too much to let it go after 200 years. In 1546, at the same battlefield, another nobleman, a French commander named Charles d'Amponier, who was also partially blind and in denial, did the same thing. Same field, same idea, same outcome. It is said that his last words were, "For glory," which is a noble way of saying, "This will not end well." To be fair, medieval commanders were good at making reckless actions into stories. That's why half of Europe's coats of arms have lions, eagles, or something on fire. Of arms have lions, eagles, or something on fire. 2 blind men charging into the same battle, centuries apart, still feels less like fate and more like a cosmic rerun. The chroniclers made both deaths seem noble. They called it Kiowalich courage. Everyone else just called it natural selection with more steps. As a result, King John's legacy became a saying in the Middle Ages. Follow your dreams, but you might want to untie the horse first. Nothing says heroic like being remembered for the same mistake. 2 times. It was the summer of 1231, a calm time in the Rhineland. In medieval times, this meant only one small plague and a fair amount of heresy. A group of monks at a small Benedictine abbey near Trier decided to celebrate their good luck by writing a new book. It was a lit-up book called On the Protection of Holy Houses. The title alone was a risk. Everyone who worked on the manuscript thought it was a true work of art. It was beautiful, full of details, and very well done. It had prayers for divine, against fire, floods, rats, and the odd Viking. The abbot was so proud that he made them add one more line to the last page. A flourish of holy confidence said, "This library will never burn because it is blessed by the hand of God." If you winced at that, congratulations. You're smarter than everyone else in the 13th century. 3 weeks later, lightning hit the abbey twice. The whole place burned down like a box of matches soaked in faith. The monks were able to save very little. Witnesses did notice one strange thing, though. When the smoke cleared, only one piece of parchment was still there, the very page that said it was fireproof by God. The people who lived through it called it a miracle. I would call it divine sarcasm, though. The story spread through the monasteries of Europe for years after that as a warning. They would say, "Don't write down your bragging. God is reading." Of course, this didn't stop anyone. For hundreds of years, monks kept writing ridiculous claims in manuscripts. "You can't lose this book. These words will last forever. There is no way Brother Anselm stole my quills." Spoiler, those manuscripts also caught fire. The church officially called the event Mysterium Fide, which means we don't know, but let's not talk about it, in medieval Latin. On the other hand, the peasants in the area were not very diplomatic. They said it was God's practical joke. It is strange that a later copy of the same manuscript, carefully rewritten by monks who were still alive, also burned up 40 years later. At that point, even heaven seemed dedicated to the bit. So, if there is a moral in medieval Europe, it is to never tempt the Almighty with confidence, especially not in writing. History shows that divine punishment has great timing for comedy. Dramatic deaths were one thing that medieval Scandinavia was good at. King Olaf of Norway did it better than anyone else. Well, except for another King Olaf of Norway, who apparently thought dying in the same valley, in the same way 200 years later was. Good brand consistency. Let's go back to Olaf in the year 130, when the Battle of Stiklestad took place. People already knew Olaf for trying to get Vikings to become Christians, which was like trying to sell salad at a meat festival. His subjects clearly rebelled. During the fight, someone shot an arrow that hit him right in the throat. He died right away, holy, brave, and probably sorry they didn't have a neck guard for their helmet. About 200 years later, Norway's PR department must have run out of ideas, of new things. Olaf IV comes along. He's another ambitious king who seems to have no idea about history. He rides into the same valley, the same battle, and the same date on the calendar. You guessed it. He gets shot in the throat. You have to admire how much they care about symmetry. The chroniclers went crazy. They called it a heavenly sign, a divine mystery. Some people said that the second Olaf chose to fight in the same place as his ancestor, which seems less like fate and more like bad luck. Making decisions. Historians later found out that his advisors told him about the omen, but he didn't listen. He said, "God decides the hour of every king's death." That hour was apparently right now. Later, People in the area said that the ground where both Olafs fell turned red and was stained with royal blood. Later, modern geologists found out that it was just soil with a lot of iron in it. People didn't do science in the 1200s, though. They did superstitions, and superstitions paid better. People began to visit the place to see the bleeding soil. It's not clear what they thought it would do. Wave. Both Olafs were eventually made saints. You might as well sell your monarchy as two kings, two arrows, one very sarcastic universe, if it keeps dying the same way. It seems like the Norse gods, who were still mad about being replaced, decided to play the same practical joke twice to show that they could still hit their targets. The medieval church was very good at a lot of things, including crusades, corruption, and it wasn't supposed to be one of them to complain about astrology and dig up dead popes. Pope Stephen V 6th looked at a dead body in 897 AD and thought, you know what? This needs a trial. Here's what happened in a way that only medieval in-laws could. Stephen hated his predecessor, Pope Formosus. So, he had Formosus's body dug up, dressed it in papal robes, and put it on a throne in front of a council. It had been dead for 9 months and was barely holding together. Historians now call it the cadaver sin, and it was just as crazy as it sounds. Stephen yelled at the body, calling it a blasphemer. Formosus was defended by a deacon, which might be the worst job description in history. The body was found guilty. Wow. Tossed into the Tiber River without its robes. That was a lot, even for the 9th century. But then things got weird. Rome flooded months later. The river brought Formosus's swollen body back to the city, perfectly preserved, and put it on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. People in the area called it a miracle. Stephen said it was a problem. Not long after that, Stephen went crazy, or as the Vatican put it, showed too much zeal. His own clergy put him in jail and strangled him in his cell. Is this just a coincidence? Could be. But that wasn't the end of it. About 200 years later, on the same day of the same month, another pope named Stephen died while giving a sermon warning people not to do the same things that Pope Stephen did. That is the most timely example of divine irony. Historians call it the curse of the cadaver. I call it a bad Yelp review from heaven. After that, Rome quietly promised never to put another dead body on trial again. Even in medieval Europe, which was full of relics and holy toenails, there were limits. The lesson is to never dig up your predecessor just to make a point. In Rome, it seems that bad ideas never die. They come back 9 months later, soaked and smelling like heaven. Payback. In the summer of 1212, Europe went crazy again and sent kids to take back the Holy Land. The reasoning was like this. If hardened soldiers can't take Jerusalem, maybe a group of 12-year-olds who aren't being watched can. It was such a dumb idea that only people in the Middle Ages could pull it off with a straight face. A French shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloes and a German boy named Nicholas were in charge. Thousands of kids said they saw angels telling them to walk to the sea where God would split the water. Instead, they got to the Mediterranean, looked at it for a while, and then realized it was still a sea. That was the best part. Some people turned back, while others got on ships that merchants had generously offered them in exchange for safe passage. Spoiler, the kids were sold into slavery right away on those ships that went to North Africa. The lucky ones got home, older and wiser, and probably allergic to religious zeal. The unlucky ones became a warning to others. Song, 200 years later, it seems like Europe was out of ideas, so they did it again. Another group of kids, who also said they had divine visions, set out on a path that was almost the same as the first. Same holy goal, same innocent hope, and no adults watching over them. Of course, they disappeared as well. Historians still argue about whether it really happened twice, or if medieval chroniclers just got mixed up, which is very likely given how they wrote things down. Are we still on the First Crusade? But one thing is for sure. The Children's Crusade became one of those stories that Europe couldn't stop telling. Part miracle, part mass delusion, and part sad comedy. Of course, the church said that the kids were inspired by their faith. Everyone else thought it was a lot of heat stroke. That year, the weather was the hottest on record. There were a lot of bandits on the roads. And it seems that no adult along the way stopped to ask, "Hey, should we maybe not let the orphans walk to Jerusalem?" If this story has a lesson, it's that. You should always have someone with you when you get divine inspiration. 2 generations of crusades, one mistake that could have been avoided. And if history really does repeat itself, there is probably a kid out there with a GPO who is planning the third one. Some families pass down heirlooms. Some people give their heirs land, titles, or shiny swords. But in 13th century England, the Clifford family seemed set on passing down only one thing: making bad choices. Their story sounds less like a noble family tree and more like a funny story that warns against hereditary stupidity. Dumbness. The first star of this sad dynasty was Sir Walter, who was accused of murder. The records don't say what happened, but since it was a long time ago, it probably had to do with horses and someone getting upset about whose saint was holier. Walter freaked out when the royal guards came to arrest him. He ran away from town and became a legend, or at least went to Wales, which was basically the same thing in the 13th century. 50 years later, history and, it seems, God's sense of humor happened again. Another Walter was killed, and you guessed it, murder. Same date, same place, same bar. One suspiciously amused chronicler says that when the sheriff showed up, this new Walter also ran away. The court notes only say, fled and presumed guilty. At that point, even the people who wrote them were rolling their eyes. You'd think that someone in the family would have gotten the hint and changed the name or stopped going to bars on that day. But no, 100 years later, another Clifford, the same name, same hairline of regret, was caught fighting with a bishop's nephew and then disappeared into the Welsh hills again. Historians think the Cliffords weren't cursed, they just didn't know how to hide bodies well. By the 1400s, doing a Clifford meant running away from your own trial. That's saying something, since there were a lot of things to run from in medieval England. The family did eventually have one success story: a Walter who lived to be old without killing anyone. Sadly, he died when he fell off his horse during a parade. People weren't shocked. The chroniclers said that the Cliffords were an unlucky family. I would personally call them the Middle Ages answer to Darwin's theory. 300 years too soon and 3 IQ points too low. Some families leave behind castles. The Cliffords left a punchline behind. Medieval Europe loved fighting about religion more than anything else, and nowhere else did theological debate get quite as heated as in Manur, a fortress high in the Pyrenees that was home to. The Cathars were monks who believed in peace, humility, and living in a place that made the Pope angry. The Catholic Church had decided that peaceful heretics was an oxymoron by 1244. So, in a shocking show of Christian kindness, they sent in an army. The siege lasted 10 months, during which both sides starved, froze, and loudly claimed that God was on their side. The Cathars said they weren't afraid of death, which turned out to be helpful. About 200 monks were inside the fortress when it finally fell, had a choice: become Catholic or die in a fire. They thought about it and said, "We'll burn, thanks." It's always nice when medieval theology can be used for a barbecue. Chroniclers said that as the monks burned, the fire made a perfect cross in the night sky. The crowd gasped. The people who were questioning said it was a sign from God. I think it was just a night with a lot of wind. This is where things start to get weird. Another fire broke out in the same valley exactly 100 years later. Same day, same place, same strange cross-shaped flames. People in the area were scared. Some people yelled, "The spirits of the Cathars are back." Some people said that our firewood was stacked badly. In either case, no one built anything there for decades. People started going to the site and saying they felt holy heat coming up from the ground. Merchants sold holy ashes that were probably just dirt with a brand on them. The church even got worried. When your own miracle looks like divine trolling, it's always awkward. Historians still can't figure out what caused the second fire. Lightning, strange weather, and signs from God. You can choose, but it's clear that Moner turned into a cursed franchise in the Middle Ages. The sequel that no one wanted, but everyone watched burn. The moral is that you should never make fun of fate by dying. It seems to have a great memory and love for reruns. 200 years, 2 hells, and 1 very judgmental sky. It was probably this that heaven sent that night. You people have learned nothing at all. Nothing. In 1356, London was doing what it always did best: smelling bad, charging too much in taxes, and acting like God liked the English more than the French. It was a rainy spring evening at Westminster Abbey, and the monks were going about their usual business, chanting, repenting, and hoping no one noticed how much wine had gone missing from the Sacramento stockroom. The ravens came then, a whole flock of them, black, loud, and according to one writer, very judgmental. They went around the towers. They all moved together like a feathered necklace. The monks stopped moving. Birds in the abbey were signs that something bad was going to happen to someone important. One monk joked nervously, "Maybe they've just come for crumbs." The others didn't laugh. People in medieval Europe thought that everything was a sign from heaven, especially if it scared them. There was a storm that night. The abbey shook with thunder, the sky split with lightning, and all the ravens disappeared at once. To a monk's mind, this was basically the medieval, the kind of movie that makes you jump. A messenger from Windsor came the next morning. The heir to the throne, Prince Edward, had died. The monks quickly fell to the ground, prayed, and started writing down what they now called the prophecy of the ravens. Word got around quickly. People came from all over to see where God's warning birds had been seen in Westminster. In the 14th century, painters even painted them with glowing eyes because they didn't know how to be subtle. People said that the ravens came back every few decades, always. Before a disaster, disease, famine, or the most recent royal scandal, the same thing happened again 2 generations later. Ravens, storms, and tragedy. This time, it was the sudden death of Edward III's grandson. The monks didn't even wait for an answer. They began to fast right away. The birds had clearly gotten better at timing. By the 1600s, superstition had become law. King Charles II was so scared of losing both his throne and his luck that he made an official royal decree. Always have ravens at the Tower of London. They're still there today, well fed, spoiled, and a little bit smug. Historians call it a custom. I call them emotional support animals from the Middle Ages. And somewhere in the sky, a group of crows is still cawing, knowing that one bad day in 1356 gave them job security for life. Historians like to say that history repeats itself, but they usually mean it in a figurative way. In 1166, England decided to take that idea literally and put on the Battle of Hastings again, this time with more déjà vu. It was. It has been exactly 100 years since William the Conqueror's famous victory in 1066, when an arrow hit King Harold's eye, and half of England got new landlords with names that started with D. 100 years later, local lords in Sussex must have thought, you know what would be fun? Doing that again. This was the start of the most pointless sequel in medieval history. The players are the descendants of the original Norman invaders and the Saxon families who are still alive and haven't let it go. Both sides even sent leaders with names. William, wait for it. England just couldn't help itself because it has a long history of recycling names. The fight started over a land dispute, which is a fancy way of saying that someone's sheep went into the wrong field. In the Middle Ages, property law worked in such a way that an argument over a fence post turned into a full-blown armed conflict. The Chronica de Sexia says that the battle happened on the same hill where the Norman Duke had. 1. There was a level of excitement on both sides that hadn't been seen since England forgot how to share. And then something really strange happened. An arrow hit one of the Williams, who was a descendant of the Saxons, in the eye. Same hill, same wound, same name, and the same groan from the heavens. Chroniclers were going crazy. Some people shouted, "A miracle." Some people yelled, A sign. No one said we should stop standing here. The church said that the coincidence showed that God still wanted the Normans to win, the people who live there. In the meantime, I just stopped going there altogether. The farmers wouldn't plow it. People who were traveling didn't want to camp on it. One very scared monk wrote, "The ground remembers." Historians named it the Second Battle of Hastings hundreds of years later. Not as well known as the first, but twice as ironic. 2 Williams, 2 arrows, and 1 cursed hill. That hill is off limits for sure if time travel ever becomes possible, because it's clear that the 12th century had its own copy paste problem. If you're looking for a saint who didn't, if you want to see someone who takes martyrdom too seriously, look no further than St. Lawrence, the saint of cooks, comedians, and people who die in a funny way. His story started in Rome in 258 AD, but his sense of humor fit perfectly into the medieval world, mostly because his death set an impossible standard for divine irony. When Emperor Valerian told people to kill Christians, Lawrence, a deacon known for giving out weapons, was arrested and told to give up the church's riches. Instead of making gold, he brought a group of beggars and said, "Here are our treasures." This is the most dangerous kind of ancient sarcasm. Of course, the Romans gave him the death penalty, but this is where Lawrence really earned his halo. They didn't want to kill him quickly. Instead, they wanted to roast him alive on an iron grill. Witnesses said he yelled, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side," as the fire burned below him. Even though he was in pain, the man was working on something. Some people say he said, "You can eat now." But that might not have been. The legend spread quickly in medieval fan fiction. He was a saint who made jokes while literally on fire, and monks all over Europe loved him. It was the kind of dark humor that only people from the Middle Ages could really get. In his honor, cathedrals were built, relics were collected, feast days were set up, and, in a move that seems too planned, many monasteries built their kitchens next to St. Lawrence's chapels, because it seems that nothing says divine protection like a saint who died while eating. But fate was still laughing. In the 11th century, a monastery in Spain that was named after St. Lawrence burned down. Not the kitchen, though. The abbot said it was a miracle. The cook said it was easy to guess. A few decades later, the same thing happened to another abbey in Normandy. The chapel is gone, but the kitchen is still there. A monk said that St. Lawrence protects his own area. Someone else said, then maybe he could expand his jurisdiction. The church naturally saw these coincidences as signs of God's favor. In my opinion, they are cosmic punchlines. St. Lawrence showed one truth that will last forever. Timing is everything, even when you're a martyr. If you're going to die for your faith, you might as well make God laugh while you do it. The year was 1313, which already sounds fishy. A date that seems like it was made to bring bad luck. Brother Reginald, a monk, sat hunched over parchment in a cold scriptorium in York, quill in hand, and was very full of himself. He was writing something he called The Mirror of the World, a prophetic book that says it can show how God has worked in history, the kind of thing you write when you're tired and think you know more Latin than you do. He wrote a line at the end of his manuscript that would make him famous hundreds of years later. The world will shake, and the age will end dramatically when two kings have the same name and fate. Yes, that's right. Sadly, yes, prophets often die as soon after writing, and Reginald did. For almost a year, no one remembered his manuscript. 300 years, collecting dust and irony in equal amounts. Then, in the 1500s, the prophecy came back with a terrifying bang. Henry II of France and Henry VII of England were both kings of their own countries at about the same time. Both were obsessed with power, vanity, and making bad choices in relationships. In a lot of ways, they were like two men in the Middle Ages racing to see who could kill themselves first. King Henry of France entered a jousting tournament in 1559 to show off his knightly strength. It had ended with a lance, a splinter in his eye. 10 years earlier, Henry VIII had died from a festering leg wound caused by, wait for it, a jousting accident. Two Henrys, two kings, two absurdly similar deaths, and one prophecy that came true a little too well. When scholars found Brother Reginald's manuscript again, panic spread faster than the plague. There were pamphlets, preachers yelling, and peasants looking at their calendars to see if the end of the world was coming. The church called the text coincidental blasphemy, which means, we can't explain this, and it's making us feel bad. The world didn't end, of course, unless you count the rise of Protestantism, a few wars, and the death of jousting as a respectable hobby. The mirror prophecy became one of the most famous coincidences of the Middle Ages. Two kings with the same name, the same injury, and the same dumb hat. If God does have a script writer, this was the episode where they really used symbols. Some people wish they could die peacefully in their sleep. Some people want to go out, in battle like a hero. But in 1199, a monk named Brother Elred died in a way that few men ever do, laughing. And for some reason, it made perfect sense for a man who had spent his whole life making fun of death. Brother Elred was not a normal monk. Before he took his vows, he worked as a jester in the court of a minor English noble. His job was to make drunk nobles snort ale through their noses. But Allred decided to change his ways at some point between the never-ending banquets and the rare food fights. He became a monk and traded. He traded bells for robes and became a surprisingly good preacher. Most of the time, the other monks liked him a lot, if you thought holiness meant having punchlines. He preached about things like God's patience and the abbot's lack of it. He once carved a happy face on the door of the refectory and named it Saint Optimus. When asked why he laughed so much, he reportedly said, "Because the devil hates joy, and I love annoying him." Of course, the abbot didn't like this and told Elred that laughter causes sin. Elred said, "Then hell must be a very boring place." An angel probably face-palmed somewhere. On a stormy night, lightning hit the bell tower of the abbey. The roof shook, the stone cracked, and a statue of Saint Felix the Cheerful that Elred himself had ordered fell from its niche. The big stone statue fell right on top of him, killing him right away. Witnesses said he was laughing because he had just told a joke about how God always knows when to do things. The chronicler wrote, "Brother, all red died laughing, just as he had joked he would. The abbot called it a warning, while the younger monks called it poetic. I think it was a stand-up set, with perfect comedic structure, setup, irony, and punchline. In death, Elred became an unofficial saint among novices, the patron of joy, bad timing, and people who can't keep a straight face during prayer. His epitaph, according to rumor, simply read, 'He laughed.' God laughed louder." If medieval Europe ever had a sense of humor, it died with Brother Elide. Humor, it died with Brother Elide, and probably chuckled all the way to heaven. In the harsh, sun-baked highlands of Lusitania, a young shepherd named Veratus watched over his flock with more patience than most generals ever had for their men. The land was unforgiving, rocky slopes, thin soil, and predators that circled the herds by night. But it was there, among the wolves and the wind, that Veratus learned endurance. Each day was a battle between man, beast, and hunger. And in those hills, the Romans were just another kind of predator. Rome saw the Iberian tribes as barbarians, wild, untamed, and conveniently taxable. To them, shepherds like Veratus were beneath notice unless tribute was due or rebellion brewing. They came demanding grain, gold, and men for their legions. But the Lusitanians were not easily bent. When the tax collectors came again, this time backed by steel, the shepherds picked up their crooks and turned them into spears. Veratus fought his first skirmish not as a soldier, but as a man defending his. Rome saw the Iberian tribes as barbaric, wild, and easy to tax. They didn't pay attention to shepherds like Veratus unless they owed them tribute or were planning a rebellion. They came to demand grain, gold, and men for their legions. But the Lusitanians were not easily bent. When the tax collectors came again, this time with steel, the shepherds picked up their crooks and turned them into spears. Veratus fought his first battle not as a soldier, but as a man defending his home. Home. The Romans thought they would quickly give up. Instead, they faced clever resistance. Veratus knew every ravine and narrow trail where cavalry couldn't follow. When the invaders marched through valleys, his people disappeared into the mountains and then attacked from behind. The shepherd became a strategist, and his hills were the perfect classroom. He wasn't an aristocrat or a general born to lead, but even among warriors, Verata was different. Calm, calculating, and incorruptible, his fellow tribesmen saw him as a leader who fought not for plunder, but for dignity. Word spread of the shepherd who humiliated Roman columns with nothing but patience and terrain. In a world where loyalty was often bought, his could not be. The Romans, of course, labeled him a bandit. That was their favorite term for anyone who refused to kneel. But even some Roman officers began to murmur admiration, grudgingly perhaps, but sincerely. Viriatus fought like nature itself, silent, elusive, and merciless when cornered. By the time Rome realized the scale of the shepherd of the hills had become more than just a man. He was a myth in the making, a ghost in the mountains, and his flocks had long since turned into armies. And Rome, with all its legions, had found its match in a man who once herded sheep. The Romans arrived in Lusitania, thinking that conquering it would be as easy as crushing an ant. They came in armor that shone like the sun, carrying standards, banners, and arrogance in equal measure. To them, this land of rugged mountains and wild rivers was just another line on a growing map. But to the locals, hunters, shepherds, and hill folk, it was their motherland. And mothers don't give up without a fight. At first, Veratus wasn't a general. He was a survivor. When Rome's prior demanded tributes and hostages, entire villages were enslaved or slaughtered. He barely escaped one such massacre, having witnessed his friends cut down and his kin taken away. That was the day he changed. The shepherd dropped his crook and picked up. For the locals' hunters, shepherds, and hillfolk rivers were just another line on a growing map. For them, it was their motherland, and mothers don't give up without a fight. At first, Veratus wasn't a general. He was a survivor. When Rome's previous ruler demanded tributes and hostages, entire villages were enslaved or killed. He barely escaped one such massacre, having seen his friends cut down and his family taken away. That was the day he changed. The shepherd dropped his crook and picked up the sword. The man who once guarded sheep would now guard his people. Veratus joined a small band of rebels who hid in the hills. Their weapons were mismatched: rusty swords, hunting spears, even farm tools. But they had something Rome didn't: patience. Veratus studied his enemy like a wolf studies a herd. He learned how their columns moved, how their scouts reported, how their discipline turned to chaos once the terrain worked against them. The first ambush came at dawn. Roman soldiers were marching through a narrow pass, tired and overconfident. Suddenly, stones rolled down the slopes, arrows whistled from the trees, and men screamed as the mountains came alive. The Romans fought bravely, but not wisely. They couldn't see their enemy, only shadows that struck and vanished. When it was over, hundreds of legionaries lay dead, and Veratus had become a name whispered with awe and fear alike. Word spread fast. A new leader had risen in Lusitania, a man who fought like the wind and disappeared like smoke. Rome sent more troops, but every campaign ended the same way: ambush, retreat, and humiliation. Even Roman historians, who didn't often praise barbarians, couldn't help but admire his brilliance. They called him a man of simple habits and great cunning. But Veratus wasn't fighting for fame. He wanted freedom, a word the Romans used a lot but rarely gave. He knew they would come back with more legions and more revenge. And as the red banners appeared on the horizon, Veratus stood on the hilltop, eyes cold and calm, already planning his next move. In a war of ghosts. By now, Rome had learned Veratus's name and hated it. His guerrilla tactics were humiliating the mightiest army in the world. To them, he was a bandit, a pest. To his people, he was the wolf of Lusitania, the one who bit the eagle's claw and lived. Veratus built his resistance not with grand speeches, but with quiet conviction. He knew every ridge and valley, every stream and shadow of the land. His army was a reflection of the terrain, fluid, unpredictable, untamable. Veratus used chaos as a weapon, while Roman generals relied on order and formations. His men traveled light, slept under the stars, and disappeared before dawn. They fought in small groups, attacking supply lines, ambushing scouts, and stealing weapons from the dead. He taught his soldiers not to fight like Romans, but against them. Never meet a wall head on, he told them. Climb it, break it, or go around it. His soldiers became expert riders and trackers, using horn signals, and Veratus used smoke signals to talk to people across the hills. When Rome sent columns of heavy infantry into narrow ravines, he trapped them between fire and stone. He didn't win by numbers, he won by wit. The more the Romans tried to crush him, the stronger his legend grew. Villagers began offering him food, water, and shelter. Shepherds became spies. Even some Iberian tribes that had been hostile to Lusitania joined his cause. Rome had tried to conquer a province, but instead they had united it. One Roman commander, Civilianus, thought he could end it with brute force. He brought 20,000 men and promised the Senate a quick victory. Instead, he found himself surrounded, with his troops starving and desperate. When Civilianus finally gave up, expecting slaughter, Viatus did something that left even his enemies speechless. He spared them. He let the Romans go free, swearing that they would respect Lusitania's independence. It was a move not of mercy, but of power. The shepherd turned warrior had forced Rome to negotiate, the humiliation recorded in their own annals. But peace with Rome was like peace with a viper. They slithered back to their camps, swearing vengeance. Veratus had outsmarted them again, but deep down he knew this couldn't last. Wolves can outrun hunters for a time, but not forever. For a fleeting moment, peace seemed possible. The treaty Veratus forced upon Civilianus was unprecedented. Rome had acknowledged a free Lusitania. The shepherd, who once hid in the mountains, was now the de facto ruler of a liberated people. His warrior called him Dux, a name that would one day be known throughout the world. Songs were sung around campfires about the man who outsmarted Rome's legions with nothing but bravery and cleverness. But Rome's memory is long, and her pride is even longer in the Senate. The news of a treaty with barbarians made the elders of Rome furious. They couldn't stand the thought of their generals bowing to a shepherd. One senator said that negotiating with rebels was like feeding. They sent a new commander to Hispania, Quintus Servilius Scipio, Fabius Maximus Quilanus' successor. He was a man with the patience of a vulture and the ambition of a snake. His mission was simple: kill Veratus at any cost. Meanwhile, Veratus ruled with humility. He didn't wear a crown or sit on a throne. He still rode his horse through the villages, greeting farmers and helping them rebuild what war had burned. He forbade looting and cruelty, insisting that they fight with honor. To him, freedom wasn't a slogan, it was sacred. Even Roman prisoners were often spared, a policy that earned him admiration from enemies and loyalty from friends. When Caepio arrived, he brought not just soldiers, but spies, informants, and silver. He knew that Varatus could not be beaten by force. He had to be weakened from within. Slowly, Rome began spreading lies, rumors of disloyalty among Varatus's allies, whispers of betrayal in the night. The new campaign was psychological. Rome offered gold and titles to those who would abandon the Lusitanian cause. Some chieftains began to waver, wondering how long they could fight a war that seemed endless. Varatus, ever perceptive, sensed the shift. He held councils under torchlight, reminding his warriors of their purpose. Rome fights for empire, he said. We fight for home. But even heroes can't hold back exhaustion forever. The war had dragged on for nearly a decade. Fields lay barren, villages empty, and even the bravest hearts began to tremble. The wolf of Lusitania was still standing, but the hunters were closing in. The Romans, humbled but unbroken, changed their approach. They no longer sought grand battles. They sought bloodless victories. Gold, deceit, and diplomacy would now do what legions could not. Caepio, the new commander, was cunning where others were proud. He studied Varatus as one might study a storm, impossible to stop, but perhaps possible to redirect. He began courting the Lusitanian tribes one by one. Messengers whispered promises of Roman citizenship, fertile land, and eternal peace. For some chieftains, the sound of coin was sweeter than the call of duty after years of fighting in the mountains. But for Varatus, such treachery cut deeper than any blade. He had built his rebellion on loyalty, not plunder. Each defection was a fracture in his heart. Still, he fought on. His scouts ambushed Roman detachments, stole their supplies, and melted into the wilderness before counterattack. Yet the victories grew smaller. The celebrations were quieter. There wasn't much food, and the horses were dying. The mountain wind didn't carry songs of victory. It carried the sound of fatigue. Varatus's wife, a fierce Lusitanian woman named Gucia, begged him to rest and think about life outside of war. But he couldn't. He told her that if he slept, Rome would wake up. For him, the fight was no longer just for land. It was for dignity and the right to live without bending the knee. Caepio, sensing weakness, tightened the noose. His spies got into Varatus's circle, spreading doubt and greed. Among them were 3 trusted lieutenants, Aldax, Dalcus, and Manurus, men who had once sworn eternal loyalty. Caepio promised them what Varatus never could: Roman gold and safe passage. When the next skirmish ended in victory for the Lusitanians, Varatus called a feast. Wine flowed, torches flickered, and laughter returned for the first time in months. None knew it would be their last night together. As the camp slept, the 3 traitors slipped into his tent. Varatus, he was tired and lay on his cot with his sword next to him. They knelt in front of him as if to ask for advice, then pulled out their daggers. The first blow went through his throat, and the second one silenced him forever. The man who had fought against Rome for almost 10 years, was dead, not in battle, but in betrayal. And as dawn broke over the hills of Lusitania, the wolf who had once howled against an empire lay still, his dream of freedom bleeding into the earth. Morning came cold and cruel. The Lusitanian camp stirred as a stir in uneasy silence. It was Gosia who found him. First, Veratus, her husband, their leader, and the heart of their rebellion, lay still, his face peaceful, as if he were just sleeping. When the truth spread, disbelief turned to wailing. The wolf was dead, and with him, the heart of Lusitania broke. His killers, Ordax, Dalcus, and Manurus, hurried to the Roman camp, expecting applause, silver, and Roman citizenship. They were led before Scipio, smiling like jackals before a lion. "We have done your bidding," they said proudly. "Veratus is no more." Scipio listened, nodded, and then turned to his guards. "Guards, Rome does not pay traitors," he said coldly. "Kill them." And so the 3 men who sold their leader for gold died without reward, their bodies dumped into the dust. Treachery, it seemed, was useful, but never honorable. The Romans believed the rebellion would die with its leader. They were wrong. When Veratus's warriors discovered how he had been betrayed, grief turned to rage. They lifted his body high on a shield, the way kings were honored among warriors, and carried him to the mountains. There, under the open sky, they built his funeral pyre out of love. The flames rose like a beacon, lighting up the valleys below. Men cried, women sang, and children held their mothers and watched the fire swallow their hero. "Here lies Veratus," they said, "the friend of justice and the enemy of Rome." Even Roman historians, who were very angry, wrote about his death with a sense of awe. The historian Appian said that Veratus was the most amazing general ever produced by the barbarian races. He had led shepherds against legions and almost won. He had forced Rome to bow, not by power, but by persistence. Yet without him, the resistance crumbled. His followers, leaderless and disheartened, signed peace with Rome. Soon after, Lusitania was absorbed into the empire, its warriors turned into subjects, its hills echoing only with memory. But legends don't die with their makers. For centuries after, Iberian storytellers whispered Veratus's name around firesides. They called him the last free man, the shepherd who became a general, and the general who became a symbol. And though Rome erased kingdoms and languages, it never erased the wolf's howl that once rose from Lusitania's hills. Years passed and Rome moved on, at least on paper. Lusitania became another obedient province, its fields taxed, its men conscripted, its language slowly drowned beneath Latin. But among the mountains and valleys, the people still told stories. Stories of a shepherd who defied an empire, of a man who could vanish into the mist, only to strike from the shadows like a spirit of vengeance. That man, Veratus, became less of a memory and more of a myth. In every village, children grew up hearing how he outwitted generals, how he showed mercy to his enemies, and how he died betrayed by those he trusted most. Mothers told their sons, Be as brave as Veratus, but never trust a Roman's promise. His name became a lesson, a symbol of resistance and integrity that even the conquerors couldn't extinguish. Ironically, some Romans began to admire him too. Philosophers like Cicero, that man, Veratus, became less of a memory and more of a myth. Children in every village grew up hearing stories of how he outsmarted generals, showed mercy to his enemies, and died betrayed by those he trusted most. Mothers told their sons, be as brave as Veratus, but never trust a Roman's promise. His name became a lesson, a symbol of resistance and integrity that even the conquerors couldn't extinguish. Ironically, some Romans began to admire him too. Philosophers like Cicero. Centuries later, people talked about him with a kind of respect that was hard to come by, calling him a great enemy of Rome, but a noble one. This was the kind of praise that the Republic only gave to men it couldn't really defeat. Even Roman soldiers stationed in Hispania talked about him with a strange reverence, like they would talk about a worthy rival who wouldn't bow. But Veratus's legacy didn't just live on because of his victories. It lived on because of his spirit. He didn't fight to become king or to steal Rome's riches. He fought for